Alright, so hey everyone. Today I want to take a look at the dead zones for Maneater. This is being demonstrated on the Xbox Series X. To start, we have a 25% axial dead zone for the movement. Movement starts very slow, but there's a distinct movement animation that makes this clear. So when moving, you start entering a swim animation, and when you fall off, there's a settling animation. When you start moving, there's a bit of a grooving animation. But because it's an axial dead zone, this applies all across each axis. So any movement within these blue regions will not output diagonal movement. So in this case, I'm moving perfectly left and right, and now left specifically in this case, perfectly forward, and perfectly backward. You only start seeing diagonal movement once both axis dead zones are passed. So that's this green region right here. And if I trace the circle around the stick, you can see that perfectly left, diagonal movement's occurring, perfectly down, diagonal movement's occurring, perfectly right, diagonal movement, and perfectly forward. And because of the shape, smaller movements are going to feel like they have less diagonal movement. You can see this range is right here, whereas if you push the stick fully, you have a pretty wide range of accessible diagonal movement. There is a nice full gradient of movement speeds, so if you point your stick just beyond the dead zone, it'll move very slow, and as you push it further, you faster until you move at your top speed. So nice full gradient of speeds accessible. The dotted threshold might be a little too difficult to demonstrate here, but both the dotted and the dashed thresholds turn the shark around. So the shark will actually, if I move very slightly past the dead zone, will actually start moving to the right. So that's happening very slowly here, but won't actually turn in that direction until I pass this dotted threshold. So the dotted applies when underwater, the dashed applies when breached on the surface like this. So you can see that I'm facing forward, and if I move back here, see that I'm moving backwards slowly, but it isn't until I break out of this threshold where you can see the shark flip in that direction. And again, facing to the right, over here, I'm moving forward and to the left slightly, but you don't see shark flip until I push the stick a little further. Looking at the map dead zone, we have a 25% square, and this is a different implementation than the normal axial dead zone applied to movement, because once you exit this dead zone, you have full diagonal movement. So if I just bob around this axis, you'll see that it actually reflects that, whereas before this would have been perfectly horizontal movement. And you can see that clearly when clamping the crosshair like this, where just bobbing around the axis flips the direction. Same with the vertical axis. The real issue with this dead zone, aside from the shape, is that this type of dead zone crops the curve. So the curve used for the map crosshair is just linear, but it starts at 25%. So this is just your normal stick input, but this dead zone just eats into that, so you can't access speeds lower than 25%. And of course, because of the shape, when you exit the dead zone diagonally, you move a little faster than cardinally. So you don't need any kind of precision for the map, but precise movements can be a little more difficult just because you don't have those really low end speeds. Looking at the camera dead zone is slightly larger than movement at about 16.5, or no, sorry, 26.5 percent, and 25% of that is due to the same axial dead zone applied to the movement, but there's additional square dead zone applied to make up that distance, the same type of dead zone that's applied for the map dead zone. Because it's the same axial dead zone, we have the same restricted movement. So in this case, I'm moving perfectly left and perfectly right. And if we look down, we can see the horizontal restriction very easily. So same with movement. This isn't ideal because the camera movement is not being not reflecting the direction that your stick is pointing in. But where this axial restriction can be a benefit is when airborne. So when you jump in the air, left and right still controls the camera as expected. But as you can kind of see there, moving vertically changes your shark's orientation. And you'll often want to either flip or turn independently, which this kind of axis restriction can help do. So you can either perfectly turn or perfectly flip, and if you want to do both, you can just move the stick far enough to access the regions where you do both. So it can be a benefit there, and in an ideal situation, the sort of underwater camera would have full diagonal movement and be radial, but while in the air would have restricted ranges, so you can do either flipping or turning independently. Sort of similar to how there's a separate threshold for turning in the direction underwater and when breached. The acceleration curve for the camera is linear, and it's actually cropped because of this slight additional dead zone, similar to how it was with the map cursor. So the curve is scaled to the 25% axial dead zone, but that additional dead zone is just cutting slightly into it. Something that might have been obvious that I haven't commented on yet is that you might notice when the stick is within the dead zone, but there's still movement being applied. This may be a movement bug or something, because when you move back into the dead zone, you can see that a lot of the movement is preserved. I don't know if this is a polling issue where maybe once your stick goes into the dead zone, it'll just check the last active stick position and then just carry that movement forward. But sometimes it doesn't register. Often it does, though, as you can see here. And I don't know the reason for it, but when you start moving, it typically corrects itself. So you see it's drifting there, but when it moved, it stopped. And sometimes it just reduces it. But since you'll be moving and looking a lot at the same time, you're really not going to see that movement occur. But when you're stationary, it does happen quite often. The next thing is there is smoothing applied to the camera. So that causes your turn speed to build up over time. So if you push the stick fully, you won't actually start at that speed. It'll start slower and then build up quickly to that speed. So this can make turning feel a little more sluggish and less responsive. And to try to demonstrate that, if I quickly change directions, you can see there's a slight lag when switching, and that's because when changing direction it hasn't built up to the fast speed yet, so there's that slight lull where it's starting at a slower speed and changing direction. And when trying to, say, spin the stick, you'll get smaller circles than you would without smoothing. So while that can, at least for general camera movement, make things feel a little more sluggish, a decent benefit for that is in this game you can bite enemies and thrash them, which has you move the right stick left and right. And smoothing would actually reduce the amount of movement during that mechanic, so it would actually be quite a bit less jarring. So they're a decent benefit in applying smoothing for that reason. Of course, as I mentioned with the flipping in air, they could always have just applied smoothing separately, specifically when you're thrashing versus when not. But they may have also had found it useful for general camera movement, even if I've listed some issues I personally have with it. Now, while I've covered a lot of issues with the axial dead zone, you have an irregular shape, you have incorrect diagonal movement as a result, some very slight cropping of your low-end movements, and aim smoothing, which can normally notably affect your accuracy in other games. Here you have some very generous auto aim. You can see that it's locked on to these enemies, and there's a very wide range where that's so you really don't have to worry about precision that much. You just have to be in the ballpark of an enemy to be able to target them properly. So it's these issues don't affect the core gameplay much at all. Oh, and to demonstrate the thrashing, this alligator will be a nice subject. You can see that it wants you to move the stick or left and right, and without smoothing that would have been quite... It's the same one. Would have been a little more jarring. The last thing to comment on is the sensitivity. So I'm playing at 10 sensitivity, this is the max, and this has you turn at 305 degrees per second. So that's pretty brisk. It's not very high compared to some other games, shooters specifically, but for this kind of game, this is perfectly fine maximum. But for the minimum at 1, we have about 105 degrees per second. So it's substantially slower, but this means that the slider range from 1 to 10 changes about 200 degrees per second. And that's not a huge range, but there is, a decent enough play in that. At 5 sensitivity, which is I think the default, you get about 210 degrees per second, which is pretty decent. So there's a decent range for the sensitivities in this game, and specifically the vertical and horizontal sensitivities are the same, which is useful because when they're different, this most often skews diagonal movement towards the horizontal axis, and in most cases that makes it more horizontally biased. So while here we have the axial dead zone greatly affecting diagonal movement, we don't have the sensitivity compounding that. So that about covers things. Of course, as usual, I think that radial dead zones would always be the best option, but at least for this type of game, there's some very generous auto-targeting, so the core of the game isn't really affected. It's just your general navigation that would have been smoothed out with radial dead zones. But yeah, that covers things. So thanks for watching, and everyone, have a great rest of your day.